Hello, I'm Tone Lanzillo, and this is Climate-Duluth. Climate-Duluth is a series of conversations with people living in our city who are concerned about and working to protect our environment and to address climate change. Today, I'm very happy to have as our guest, Jamie Harvie. Welcome, Jamie.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, I really appreciate this. Why don't we begin by sharing the story about Bagot-Duluth, the campaign, maybe where it started and where we're at now.
Sure. So Bagot-Duluth is a campaign, which means it's a group of individuals and organizations that have been together for about 3 years. And this is actually really the second iteration. There was an earlier iteration, but for the purposes of this conversation, the work that's going on now, Bagot-Duluth is about 3 years old. And it came, it was sort of really initiated by a couple of individuals who approached me and was wondering if I'd be willing to help facilitate the campaign and the effort around single-use plastics. And honestly, at that time, they weren't at the top of my list. My history is that I have been working nationally and internationally on environment and health issues. But I gave it some thought, and I thought if anywhere in this country that we could help people to start thinking more deeply and broadly about the environment and the need to shift our culture and our way of being, that Duluth would be the place. So 3 years ago, we had a couple of meetings. We brought some invited individuals in who we thought would have some resonance. And what we did first of all was we sat down and we just sort of discussed why we cared about the issue of bags and plastics and climate, and it was really powerful because it really, I think, set an important foundation that's really reflective of the values of Duluth. So for some people, they just didn't like litter, right? Okay. They didn't like the idea of walking around seeing litter. For others, they were deeply concerned about the science and the stories that we're starting to hear about plastics in the ocean and the impacts on wildlife. So sea turtles and marine animals that just hit them in a spot that where they just couldn't not sit still, right? And then for others, it was around climate issues, right? And climate change, and recognizing that we are in this climate emergency and that we have to do everything we can to change our behaviors to reduce the energy that we use, the embodied energy and the resources, and make those shifts. But then there's also sort of a sacredness, right? And it was interesting because we sort of went around the room a couple of times, and it felt as though there was sort of this unspoken language of what I call the sacred, right? Okay. And it was this love of Duluth and the environment, future generations. It's sort of a spiritual thing, but people always kept saying, you look at that lake, right? How can we take care of the lake? So that's about 3 years old, and we started with our core values. That was really really connected us.
Okay. What currently is going on with Bagot-Duluth? What's at the top of the list right now?
Right. So over the last 3 years, we developed 3 goals. Okay. One was to put it was all about getting a city ordinance, because we just can't educate ourselves out of the problems that our society is facing us, right? We've been doing education around plastics and recycling for 20 years or so, and there's a point where we have to change our behavior. So the campaign has 3 goals. One is to put a fee on single-use bags, carry-out bags, the ones that you have at the grocery store, at the checkout counter. The other is to make straws available only by request in restaurants, and the third is to phase out styrofoam. And so where we are right now is that City Council has been discussing this since September 23rd. At the most recent City Council meeting, they adopted a couple amendments to an ordinance that had been introduced on that September 23rd date. And they introduced an amendment that would exempt paper bags from the proposal. So again, the fee was on paper and plastic. Right. And so that's where we sit. So on November 12th, I believe it is, it's a Tuesday, will be the next City Council meeting when there'll be an up or down vote on the ordinance, or potentially more amendments that, who knows, that councillors might bring. We're feeling pretty confident that the questions that had been concerning councillors have been addressed, and that will be up and down vote, whether for or against on Tuesday, on that 12th.
Cool. Let's say the ordinance does pass. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the plans for PACT-Duluth over the next year into 2020?
Right. Well, so again, we had 3 goals. So, so if it passes, it will be a half step, right? Because they're only going to put the fee on plastic, not paper. And those two, without that paper fee, it's not as powerful a shift to that culture of reuse that the city, of all the citizens and supporters of the campaign, have been asking for. Okay. But to answer your question, we have 2 other objectives. One is reusable straws and styrofoam to-go containers, so that we would phase those out. And one of the challenges on it, quite honestly, that we've been asking City Council to adopt these 3 proposals, and up until September, not one councillor had been willing to step up to be willing to introduce, and it was surprising, quite frankly. You know, this is a city that calls itself this outdoor city, right? And so we are hopeful that a councillor next spring or next year, once we have a new city council seated, that there'll be a councillor that will say, listen, there are more than 2,000 individuals that have added their name to our PACT-Duluth pledge. We have 120 businesses and organizations that we want them to, and yes, I will, as a city councillor, step up and introduce the ordinance. So that's what we're aiming for in the future.
Got you. When you step back and look at the city, what do you think are some of the pressing issues when it comes to the environment and climate change for our greater community?
I think the climate change has to be the number one issue, right? Okay. And everything else falls under that. And I think we can get confused that climate change is just about energy that we use, and in a way it is. But it also has to do with how we farm and their agricultural practices, has to do with our whole our waste and our material economy, and how we minimize the embodied energy that we're using in those. And so it just requires this incredible transformation, really a shift to what some call a circular economy, which is really putting our economy in alignment with natural systems. And we know natural systems don't create waste. So how do we do that? How do we create closed loop systems so that if we're using, in the case of products, right? How do we minimize their use, right? Okay. So they're not always creating excess, using it one day, throwing it out the next. But then at their end of life, that they're designed in a way that they can be reincorporated back into the system and reincorporated into new materials. But it's again realigning ourselves with natural systems.
Okay. And as far as city government, what are the types of things you'd like to see maybe city government either focus on or work on over the next, say, 4 to 5 years? Anything in particular?
Oh, there is so much. So I was chair of the Environmental Advisory Council 25 years ago. Oh, wow. And we passed the first resolution on sustainability. And so the city council and the city of Duluth has, I don't know, I'm joking, it's a stack of resolutions this high, right? Okay. It's not really. We probably have 5 or 6 or 8 relative to the environment, which sort of lay out some steps that they could do on environmentally preferable purchasing, on pesticide-free parks, on climate mitigation. They could, as it relates to the Bag It campaign, look at styrofoam and plastics use within the city. Right. But I think we have to be cautious, right? Because the city, right, as an entity, right, has a role to play in modeling. But but we need our business leaders, the leaders in higher ed and healthcare. We are in a place where we have to all come together, and the citizens of Duluth, right? So how do we come together? And I'd offer that we actually need a citywide climate action plan, right? That looks at waste, that looks at food, that looks at a whole variety of the activities that make up this beautiful city of ours.
Okay.
Right.
So
it's not only about what government should do, right? In the city, it's about what we all can do. And so it's how do we get out of our silos of our various spheres of our restaurants, our hotels, our educational system, our healthcare. We have to come together with citizens and create a plan that can really help Duluth transform and really model, or in my mind, I think we have the incredible wisdom and creativity here in Duluth that we can really model a plan for Minnesota and for the globe.
what inspires you in this work? Where do you get your motivation or energy from?
So, I think for me it's about connecting with people, right? Okay. When it all comes down to it, it's when you do this work and you're having conversations, and when people can see that they can make a change, right? Make a difference that's bigger than themselves, and that light goes off, that's juicy for me. That's really gets me fired up. And I think that's really it. And so years ago, I worked coordinating work nationally and internationally with the healthcare sector, and to see a purchasing agent suddenly realize that the products that they're purchasing, by changing what they were for products that were, foods that were, fair trade or had less toxic compounds, and they could suddenly see how that could make a tangible difference on people living in fence-lined communities that are being poisoned by toxics. It was like, wow. And so having people see and experience the agency, their ability to affect change, is what really charges me up. And some of these issues are really big. They're daunting, Tone, and you know that. You're putting together the show, and it's a lot of work. And so I think we also have to recognize that that we have to care for ourselves. And we need places to restore and regenerate. And for me, it's going out into the woods and finding that quiet, and that kind of feeds my soul. And for me, it's Lester Park. I'm in there every day.
That's great, thank you. When did your interest in the environment, climate change begin? When you look back over your life, where do you think the trigger point was?
So I grew up north of Montreal. And in the woods. And I think for me, just being there, it sort of laid a foundation. And my father, I spent a lot of time with my father in the woods. We'd make fires, we'd do maple syrup. In the winter, we'd hang out in his workshop. And he was someone who, he was a survivor of a concentration camp. He was, And I think I always kind of questioned, how could this loving, caring person, right, move forward in this world and not hold anger, right, for an experience that's unimaginable, right, unimaginable. Right. And I think during my childhood, I would ask, like, how can we do something better? Like, I embodied in that. How can we not do the crazy things we crazy humans do, right? And so my trajectory took me really, I think, in a path of exploration, and I ended up in Central America, where I was doing volunteer work, and there again, one could see the influence of business enterprises that were impacting the lives of individuals, and how And it was just really hard to see, right? That it's felt as though money and resources ended up just devastating, destroying lives. And then I came to Duluth, happened to come and move to Duluth, and I was working at the WLSSD, the Western Lake Superior Sanitary
Right.
District, and got involved in some of their early, recycling programs. And remember, it's reduce, reuse, and then recycle, not recycle number one. I think we took the easy step by talking about recycling as though we could recycle our way out of things. So
Right.
just a reminder. But there, I worked on a landmark initiative which. Around mercury and persistent toxics. These are chemicals that are in our bodies, right, that are neurotoxins or endocrine disruptors. They impact human development. They're carcinogens. And many of these, so mercury, those people who fish are familiar with mercury, right? So mercury, the majority of mercury coming into the Great Lakes comes from outside of our watershed. Right?
Okay.
So you start to recognize that we're part of this global ecosystem, right? That we're all interconnected, right? And so you can point at so that what we do actually impacts people thousands of miles away and vice versa. And so that we all have to step up,
Yes.
right? And so it was sort of, I think, through this course of 15, 20 years, I think it's not really about environment, it's about a sense of deep relationship to one another and how we connect hearts. And that includes with the natural world, because we are the natural world, right?
Yeah.
So we are trees, we are fish, and no matter whether swimmers or crawlers or the color of our skin makes no difference. We're all intimately connected,
Right.
and so for me, that's I think in some ways it goes back to what I was saying earlier on, right? It's about relationship,
Yeah.
and. So is it environment? I don't know if it's really about environment. I think issues around social justice, environmental issues are all the same, right? How do we not other? How do we not create barriers between one another? How do we not create these artificial boundaries between the natural world and humans? We're the same thing, right? Right? No matter the color of our skin, no matter, whether we're two-legged or swimmers and crawlers, we're all the same thing, right? So so it's a mindset that I think I get excited by. How do we shift the mindset from one of sort of transaction and othering to like deep relationship?
Wow, thank you. How has your personal life changed, or what changes have you made in your personal life in regards to these issues over the years? And some people, of course, they stop driving. Some people change their diet. For you, have you noticed any changes in your own life over the years?
I don't think I've changed a whole lot, quite honestly.
Okay.
I've never really been one for things like buying, I'm not one who gets excited by the latest toy or the latest things,
Okay.
We're actually about to get a new couch, and the old one's pretty ratty. Our dog's been sitting on it. But honestly, it's like, do we really, in my head, I kind of like that couch. And so, but I think we have, it's this fine line. I don't know if buried in your question, right? It's about personal, I don't think what we do as individuals is going to get us out of our sort of ecological crisis and climate emergency. It's what we do together.
Okay.
Right? So we can get confused by that, right? Because I think those that want the system to stay the same will say, oh, what are you doing, Toner? What are you doing, Jamie? It's only about you. But it's really about what do we do together? How do we come together? I think that's what's been exciting to see, these thousands of people who have signed this Bagot pledge from Morgan Park to Lester Park. It's the city of Duluth representing all zip codes that are asking their city to come together, and we show up at city council in a kind and respectful way. And I think for me, that's this sense of like, how do we do stuff together is powerful, and that's most. We have to do things together, and we have to learn, because I think we've lost that muscle, that relationship muscle of how we do things together. We've lost that muscle a little bit.
Huh. What do you think could develop that muscle, or strengthen us as a community?
I think it's in ways it's by practicing, right? How do we not get the limelight? You have to remember, our culture is the American culture.
Right.
I've been here 25 years, but I have my Canadian genes, right? But it's deeply individualistic in this country, right?
Okay.
And so people always look for the superstar or the hero, right? And I don't think that's necessarily an American thing, but it's a little bit more reinforced. And I think and so what that tends to do is want us to look for the leader versus looking for the leader in ourselves, right?
Okay, yes.
And it's also developing a different type of leadership, which is really about how do we enable those all around us versus taking the limelight and taking charge and so forth. So it's and so I honestly I think I see it in when you look at female leaders, they're just more naturally oriented. As I'm a guy, and I think you see that, and it's not like it's there's a spectrum of leadership styles, but for the most part, it's more of a sort of matriarchal approach versus a patriarchal approach, right? It's more collaboration and seeing the power within instead of power over instead of the versus the power within, and it takes a certain type of personality, but that's the type of leadership that's being called for. Was being called for 10 years ago, and we absolutely need it now. But I think it's we can make individual changes, but if we do it together, so often people have said, "What can I do on this Bag It campaign?"
Okay.
And I said, get together with a bunch of friends and do an email together or call a city councilor together.
Okay.
Because by themselves, people get scared, right?
Yes.
They feel that, and engaging in the democratic process is often really new for many people, right? And it shouldn't be new. That's the kind of muscle we have to exercise. So doing it together is really takes the energy and can be fun. It can be fun, right? Because you can have fun doing things with people.
Yes,
right?
you can.
Right?
Yes, you can. When you look around the greater community, who are some of the people that you see today that give us hope and inspiration, whether it's high school, college? Have you noticed?
I think it's everywhere, Tone.
Okay.
They're the Gretas, right? We have our she's the Swedish teenager. She's still a teenager who's inspiring the globe. But each community has those. We've had Sophie Williams, who has stepped up at city council and testified, and there's a number of them. But I think we have to listen to our youth, right? Like, I don't have as much gray hair as you do, but I have some. But like, what are we leaving them? I've got children. What are we leaving them? Right? And so I think that's who we have to start listening to, especially because we have an obligation to. But I see people. People in congregations who have for the first time spoken up at city council.
Okay.
We did a little training, right? People have never sort of done that, stepping up and feeling engaged. But you can see it in all walks of life. You can see professionals. You could see it, blue collar, white collar. There are a lot of leaders out there, and I'd be cautious about us thinking about the ones who may be in the paper as being the leaders. There's a ton out there, and those are the ones who I get most excited by. It's the ones who suddenly starting to see their inner voice is able to like be an outer voice. Those are the ones who I get most excited by. But unquestionably, there's incredibly good work. The work that you're doing on the climate vigils and putting the show together. You came to town 2 years ago, year and a half ago. You're an inspiration for many people. But there are many. But I think we have to look at the internal leadership that so many of our citizens are starting to exhibit. That's what charges me up.
Very good point. Over the next several weeks, for anyone who watches the show, what would you like people to do in regards to the Bag It Duluth campaign? Any special requests as far as getting involved or how they can support the campaign over the next few weeks?
Well, over the next few weeks, we would welcome them to, first of all, come to the city council meeting on November 12th, and we're pretty sure that's when the vote is going to be. And so you can go to our Facebook page or the webpage, the Bag It Duluth webpage.
Okay.
And but we just need people to show up and say, listen, City Council, it is time to act. It's been 2.5, 3 years now that the citizens of Duluth have been asking for some change. So that would be really helpful.
Okay.
We have our Bag of Duluth pledge. People can add their name to that, and
Okay.
which is basically asking people to make a personal commitment, a step forward to work towards zero waste, but also asking our city council and our elected officials to make changes in Duluth around zero waste.
Okay.
Because once this ordinance is passed, and we're confident it's going to be passed, that we then still have styrofoam and straws to work on, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is we're not going away. The issues aren't going away. So we need these voices for the next couple of months and more.
Okay.
So those are some actions. I don't know if we can convince City Council to undo the amendment as it relates to the fee on paper bags.
Right.
Honestly, it's quite disappointing because it makes what is going to be moving forward a half step versus a full step, right?
Okay.
The fee, so what we propose is a fee on paper and plastic, because
Right.
that creates a cultural shift towards reuse, like it incentivizes it. So without having that fee on paper, some consumers will then move towards paper as the easy choice of bags, right?
Right.
So it doesn't do really what, boy, our community is asking council to have, it's not doing what we've been asking council to do. At the same time, even if it's a half step, and we can't budge council, we will, by passing it as it is, we will be able to create a model for fees,
Okay.
right, that will influence the rest of the state of Minnesota. And so we know Minneapolis is now actually holding hearings for a fee on paper
Okay.
and plastic bags. So if we can be the first in Minnesota around this, we can hopefully make the pathway for a much bigger population center to make that shift as well.
Okay.
And so either way, it'll be a positive thing, and it would be really great to get people involved.
Okay. Jamie, I want to thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it. It's great, and I admire all the work you're doing. In closing, I'd like to read a short quote from the book called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist by Paul Kingsnorth, and I think it's very appropriate given what Jamie shared with us today. Quote, "Something I've come to understand slowly over my lifetime is that nature, earth, the world, whatever you call it, is not something that I'm on, but something that I am. It is not outside of me, it is me, and I am it. There is no outside. Nature as a concept has always been flawed. Many traditional societies have no word for nature as something separate from humanity, because there was no obvious reason to separate humans from everything else that lived. There still isn't. Felt experiences of deep connection with all of life are a central part of virtually all spiritual traditions, and with good reason. Nature is us, and we are nature," unquote. Thanks for joining us today, and on behalf of PACT-TV, we appreciate your support, and we hope you will share this show and this series with friends and family. Take care.